Well, today we come to the fifth part of our series, a series that we are calling Encountering Jesus. And in this series, what have we been doing? We've been taking a look at some of the letters of Paul, exploring letters that Paul wrote to some of the early churches in places like Galatia, Thessalonica, Philippi. And let me just say, if you had to miss any of those first four messages in this series, maybe all, I encourage you to go online, go to our website, listen into where we've been. I think that can just add to the foundation that I hope can be helpful when it comes to truly encountering and walking with Jesus. Jesus, you are enough. You know, what does it mean to encounter him in that deep a way? So having said that, and let me say as well, Jason Locker a couple of weeks ago, oh my goodness, what he brought to us. So while you're online, listen into what he shared as well. But having said that, today we come to yet another of Paul's letters. This time a letter that he wrote to a group of churches in the capital city, in the city of Rome. And in many ways what we find here is this beautiful description of how God is going to make things right in this world, just to put it simply. Meaning clearly the world has drifted from what God originally intended it to be. Clearly that's the case in our day, in Paul's day. And so here is Paul saying, here's how God is going to make things right, in part by making us right with God. Here's Romans chapter 1, starting with verse 1. Again, if you want to follow along, here's Romans 1, starting with verse 1. I'm going to jump to 16 and 17, just to give you a heads up. Start with verse 1, we'll move to verses 16 and 17, and then we're going to come back to, at the very end, verse 7. Mostly spending our time in 16 and 17. Here's Romans 1, starting with verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Hear that, gospel being our focus. He was set apart for the gospel. The gospel God promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. And then we drop down to verses 16 and 17. And there we find this. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone. Everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now, one of the interesting things about this passage, even just about these two verses, is this. These two verses greatly helped a German friar, priest, monk, however we want to describe him, a man by the name of Martin Luther. Probably a familiar name to all of us, whether or not we know much about him or not. But we know that these two verses helped him to do this. As devout as he was, as much as he was already walking in faith, part of the church, we know that these two verses helped him to do this. Simply put, they helped him finally to understand what the gospel really was all about, and what did that do for him? Changed everything for him. Now, how do we know these two verses were instrumental in his life? Because we find him saying that in some of his writings. In fact, in the preface to one of his writings, we find these words. They are words, on the one hand, that do describe his personal conversion experience. But on the other hand, these are words as well that tell us the role this passage played in that. So give a listen to what he writes. This is Martin Luther. I greatly long to understand Paul's epistle to the Romans, but nothing stood in the way more than that one expression, the righteousness of God. Because I took it to mean that justice, whereby God is just and he deals justly in punishing the unjust. And my situation was that though an impeccable monk, meaning I know I've been very faithful in my life, he writes, though an impeccable monk, I stood every day before God feeling like a sinner, troubled in conscience. So here is someone of deep faith struggling with the very thing that's supposed to bring him great peace, right? He continues, I had not confidence that my goodness, my merit, the things that I was doing would assuage or satisfy God. You ever been there? Therefore, I did not love a just God, but rather I hated and murmured against him. And then I saw the statement, the righteous will live because of faith. He says, I then grasped that through gift and sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Thereupon I found myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise. He concludes with this, when I discovered the distinction that the law, we might say, this ethic of God that describes how we are to behave, what we are to do, he says, when I discovered the distinction that the law is one thing and that the gospel is another, I broke through. And when Luther says that he broke through, here's what he means. In that moment, he finally understood, again, what the gospel really was. And that understanding did this, changed everything for him. First, we know it would change his relationship with God, because we just heard a moment ago how he was dealing with God prior to this. But this understanding of what the gospel was really all about also changed completely how we related to others, and especially how we related to the church. Here's my prayer for us today. If there are some among us who feel like we have never broken through, if you will, meaning we've been in the church for a long time, we've been walking with Christ, we've been striving to be a person of faith, but the more we think about it, even through just these introductory remarks today, some of us maybe who've even been in the church for a long time, we still feel like, when it comes to the gospel, there's still some confusion there. I don't know if I'm embracing it fully for what it is to be. If some of us, if that's where we are, then I pray that today's time together might make the difference, might be a huge help. On the other hand, if you're one who thinks, I've already broken through, and you give thanks for that, then I hope our time together might simply do this for you. It might help you to better understand how you can now share with others who really need it this genuine gospel, this life-changing gospel. So that being our focus, here's our key question. What is the gospel really? What is the gospel really at its very center, at its very core? Now, the best place to start when it comes to answering that question is to look at the Greek word out of which our word being gospel. To answer this, it's helpful for us to look at the Greek word, we've talked about this before, out of which the word gospel springs. That word being euangelion, which literally means good news. Now, some of us today might say, well, guys, that's pretty obvious. Isn't the gospel is good news? I know that. And yet not so obvious when we go deeper here today. Here's why it's so important for us to understand the gospel truly is good news. Because far too many Christians today They don't see the gospel as good news. They don't live their lives as if the gospel is good news. Instead, they live their lives seeing the gospel as simply, you ready? Good advice. And thinking of it only as good advice keeps them from what? The very breakthrough that Luther is talking about here. Or maybe more specifically, let me say it like this, and I hope this is helpful to you. Guys, the gospel is not simply good advice as to what we need to do in this life. Instead, the gospel, the good news, is this: what needs to be done in this life, it's already been done for us. That's good news, isn't it? Or the gospel is not simply good advice as to how we can win the battle that life at sometimes truly is. Instead, the gospel, the good news is this. You can probably almost say it with me. The battle's already been won, right? That's good news. Again, far too often we think of the gospel as a call to do something, to follow Jesus, to love God and others, to embrace the golden rule, however we might think of it. And yet, as important as those things are, and they are important, they're a part of our walk with Christ, must be. But as important as those things are, if the gospel gets reduced to that, as just something we are to do, if that happens, then far from relating to the gospel as God would have us relate to it, if we boil it down to what we are to do, then this misunderstood gospel drives us most of the time to one of three things. First off, if we reduce the gospel to what we are to do, many of us as Christians will kind of write it off as something else on our to-do list, and therefore we'll relate to this amazing good news with apathy, right? All because we're misunderstanding what the gospel is really all about. Others of us as Christians, when the gospel gets boiled down to what we are to do, this misunderstood gospel for some of us will lead us to guilt, to despair. You know, when we're looking at it as action we must take, we might think, I'm not up to it, God. I can't do this. Can you imagine a God who wants us to receive with joy and we come back with just guilt? And then some of us, shame on us, but it happens. Some of us as Christians, when the gospel gets reduced down to what we are to do, some of us then respond to the gospel with pride, with self-righteousness. Man, I got it, God. Look what I've done in order to embrace this walk with Christ. Guys, knowing that none of that speaks to how God wants us to receive what He's done for us, knowing that, here's how Paul tries to draw us back in, keep us from getting caught there. With these words in verse 17, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God, again, whose righteousness, whose goodness? God, not ours. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And what Paul is really getting at here again is this, that the gospel isn't about our righteousness. The gospel instead is all about God's righteousness, His goodness. Because here's what God's righteousness will lead us to. Jesus on a cross saying this to us, tell you what, I'll trade you my goodness for your sinfulness. I'll trade you my righteousness for your unrighteousness. I'll trade you even my life for your death. Good news. There was a show on a few years ago, I think it was 2013, 14. Maybe some of you saw it. Maybe you at least caught one episode. It was called Barter Kings. And this show was really, in essence, about this. It was about these two guys who would take something of very little value And trade after trade after trade, they would turn that something of little value into something at times of great value, but at least it would be of more value than what they started with, right? And we would think about that and say, yep, that's how we would like it to be if we were in the midst of that, right? This upward spiraling trade, we might call it. I share that today in order to say this. That's not at all what we find here with our amazing, loving God. That's not at all what we find here, because this trade that God makes with us, this trade that springs out of his righteousness, this trade is a downward spiraling trade for him, right? Think about, okay, I'll trade you life for death. So why in the world would God in all his wisdom make such a trade? Because of his unfathomable love for us, his unfathomable love for you. Now, having said all of that, that's the true gospel. Let's not misunderstand it. That's the true good news, what God has done. Having said that, we do need, before we close, to come back around to what we do in this life, because that does matter. Our attitudes, our behavior, our actions, those things do matter. So turning now to that, listen to what Paul writes now in verse 7. So back to verse 7. Paul writes this, "To all in Rome who are loved by God," in other words, to all in Rome who have embraced the true good news in a way that has caused them now to lean not on their own righteousness, their own goodness, but to now fully lean on God. He writes, "To all in Rome who are loved by God, you are called to be what? You are called to be his holy people." In other words, what Paul is saying here is this, that while the gospel itself isn't dependent upon something we do, he's saying, even though that is true, this is also true. You can't truly experience the gospel and not have it change you completely. Or maybe this is a helpful way to think about it. And I think Paul would say, great way to speak to it. You can't be touched by God's righteousness and not have that divine righteousness begin to grow within you. You can't be touched by God's goodness and not have that goodness begin to take over in your heart. And why is that the case? Because when you truly break through, as Luther spoke to that earlier, when you truly break through, you begin to understand what the gospel is all about. When that happens, simple as this, that sets you free. Free from what? Apathy, pride, arrogance, guilt, despair. Man, when we get it and we embrace the true gospel, it sets us free from all those things so that what? So that we might be free to be who he made us to be in the first place. And I said earlier how the world can be transformed. The more we embrace the true gospel, the more we live into that, the more God's goodness grows in us. We take on the attitude, the behavior, the actions he planted in us from the very beginning. The more we do that, one by one, the world changes. As we close, let me just ask you this, and then we'll move into a time of communion. When it comes to the gospel, have you, like Luther, broken through? Meaning, you've really come to the point in your life when you realize the gospel is absolutely not simply good advice. It's not a to-do list. It's not something that should ever bring pride or guilt or any of those kinds of things. Are you at a point in your life where when it comes to the gospel, when it comes to the true good news, you realize This is simply a righteousness, God's righteousness, a divine righteousness that when received, it'll change everything for you. Is that where you are? If so, embrace that. Let that build within you that you might be who God longs for you to be. On the other hand, if you haven't received the gospel in that way, you think about some of these other things and you realize, oh gosh, much more than just receiving his goodness in a way that transforms me, I am caught in some of these other things. If that's you today, one, don't feel guilty about that, okay? But just like Luther, begin to embrace, begin to experience a conversion in very real ways. If that's you, then today and the week ahead, just keep praying over, not the misunderstood gospel, but the true gospel, that new life might truly be yours.